Welcome to Blue Grit Radio, the podcast that explores making better cops for a better community. I'm your host, Eric Tung. I've been an active police officer since 2007. We will dive into the aspects of police culture, health and wellness, leadership, and mindset. You'll hear from experts not only from policing, but all industries as they relate to being our best with purpose, passion, and positivity. Join me as we share stories, lessons, and advice so we can all be better for ourselves, our teams, our families, and our communities. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is your host, Eric, and today I'm joined by Hailey Palos. Hailey, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those that don't know, she's a clinician, she's a counselor, she's the host of the Mental Cover podcast. Hailey, can you just tell us a little bit about what you do and as well as the podcast? We're just going to start it off strong.
Yeah. So, yes, I am an associate marriage and family therapist. I'm actually dual registered in California, so I'm also an associate professional clinical counselor. Nothing too special about the difference. Marriage and family just means I had a lot of family systems theory and things like that in my education. So, I found that really cool and valuable. The other clinical counselor is a national registration. So, should I ever choose that California and I are no longer friends for some reason, I can have a national registration and more easily transfer my careers. So, um, that's why both. And to be a licensed therapist in the state of California, you have to have 3,000 hours and you operate under a supervisor. So I am still under supervision with an amazing supervisor. I think I have like 200 hours left. So this is the year.
That's going quick.
I'm very I'm excited. I had taken about a year, probably not a year in full, but something around that. After I had my son, I took somewhere around a year off. So I'm really excited to just check that box and sit for this stupid standardized test that California.
Everyone loves the standardized test. False.
Luckily, false. Yeah. I think I do a pretty decent job at testing, so that works out.
That's
When
good.
I
You'd
did
know by
my
now.
I do know. You have to sit. So before you're even licensed, every year before you renew your registration, you have to sit for a law and ethics exam until you pass it. And I was so happy I passed for both registrations the first time I went in. And I was like, that was so much easier. So I'm hoping the clinical exam is easy. And what I mean by easier is I still withhold my financial licenses. So for anyone that might listen who's in the finance world, I had the Securities Industry Essentials, the SIE exam, which was brand new the year that I was going for my financial reg, and the Series 7, which is the hardest standardized test. So I feel
I've
like,
heard of this test.
yeah, I'm good to go. I have been to the worst exam I could ever sit in.
Man.
Um, but yeah, so that's that side of me. And I can dive deeper into why I became a therapist and all that
Yeah.
whenever we're ready. But I am also the spouse of a law enforcement officer. So that's another layer to me that kind of is the intersection between my clinical world and my personal, and one of the honestly the key reason why I started working in the first responder realm as a therapist after my husband and I have quite a complex little story about how we finally got to somewhat settle in this career. I put that in air quotes for anyone who is listening and won't be able to see that, because do you ever really settle?
Settle. Man. I mean, in some ways, like, it's funny because it's a good thing in so many ways, and then it's like you don't want to settle. Like, you want to keep growing, right? Like, there's a lot of ways to interpret that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for us it's like it's a settle from where we were,
Yeah.
where you're in academy life and the agency my husband works for can send you anywhere after you graduate. And so we were separated for a period of time.
Yeah.
And we didn't have like a life settle, relationship settle, a family settle for
Yeah.
3 years in total, because there
Yeah.
was also a COVID academy. So yeah, lots of layers.
That's a lot. Yeah. And I'm glad. I mean, you hit on all the things as things are hovering in my brain, and I'm like, yeah, we want to hit on the fact that you're also a first responder spouse, law enforcement spouse. But yeah, that uncertainty is challenging, and I'm specifically excited to have this conversation because of that cross section that we talked about already, right? Which is that you are a mental health professional, you work with families, you work with all first responders, and then you're living it, right? You're in this. You have a young family, you got a little one, and so now that settling in a good way is just like literally like the pieces are not just floating around like in the eye of a hurricane, where you actually have some stability in a career and a life, like a family life that has a lot of volatility with shift work, with what your spouse brings home and what you hear about. And so it also offers this, I'll just say, scary amount of awareness, hyper awareness from your angle, because you know what a lot of people face in the industry and what your husband's going to be dealing with and already dealing with and what you're going to be dealing with. Right. So there's a lot of angles and layers there.
It's a really good word for it. Gosh, I was literally messaging with somebody yesterday actually for the Mental Cover podcast, which I didn't even touch on, and I will in a moment. But I was messaging someone that I was super interested in connecting with and having on the Mental Cover podcast. And this person had mentioned how they realized in connecting with other spouses that so many spouses don't really fully understand what happens in these careers. And I think I don't even recognize sometimes that very thing because I am so enmeshed in the career. I don't know. I really don't know if that has to do with being a therapist, being curious. It's part of my nature before I got my degree, even to just kind of ask questions and want to understand and learn. And if I'm doing something, then I'm going to really dive into understanding it. And doing something for me was supporting my spouse through that. And even I kind of knew when we first met that this was a path he might go down. So even just in that, of like, hey, we both kind of arranged, I always joke we arranged marriage to each other.
Mm.
Because we had like a 4-hour first date that was like, here's all the crap you could ever hear about me. Here's all the things I've done that I have had to work through. Here's how I've been harmed. Here's how I've caused harm. Like, are you cool with this?
Yeah.
Um,
What
and
led
so
you to
that
that?
was one of
If
those.
I can pry, feel free to you know, push the pry away. But yeah,
Right.
what created that? Hey, brass tacks. Here's what you're getting. Here's my suitcase. Look at my baggage. What do you think? Does it go with yours?
Yeah. Honestly, for both of us, a lot of wounding. For me, I had a lot of childhood trauma. So, a parent figure of mine was every form of abusive that you can name.
Hmm.
And actually, for a lot of years of my life, I had some traumatic amnesia around things that have happened. And even still, I have memories, but I wouldn't say that I have like a full on story
Hmm.
from my young child life. So I discovered a lot. Actually, right before I got pregnant as well, I was working and realized, like, whoa, hold on. This is some form of dissociation I'm feeling, and I can't ignore it because I've been a therapist for a while now. So I know what this is. And I learned so much about things that had happened to me by just connecting to my body and realizing areas that were activated. So over time, what happened in my life is those things started to play out as anyone who has any understanding of this will watch different things play out. And the big one for me, being that I was so young, is attachment. So I had some pretty rough, intimate partner relationships for a
Hmm.
while. somebody who just like didn't want to give up on people. But I was also in a situation at some point where I really wounded an intimate partner because I was really struggling to figure out myself and like work through my trauma and just who the heck I was at that point in my life and who I wanted to be. And growing up with the trauma that I grew up with, it was very like you weren't allowed to be somebody except for what that person wanted you to be. And that was just how you established safety, which I know we really touched on for a minute when you were on the mental cover.
Yeah.
So a lot of fear and just fear really ruled my life. And I engaged in relationship that way for so long that I was done with that. I was doing healing work. I wasn't looking for anyone. We literally connected because at the time there was and not we're not going to be political, but there was an election going on, and everyone on every way was up in arms about this election. And I was just like doing so much of my own work. I was taking pictures of pancakes for breakfast and was just like, this will be me in my own little like I
Yeah,
am
like
not
pancakes over
capable.
politics. We should make a t-shirt.
Yes,
Yeah.
pancakes over politics. So he ended up messaging me. We actually went to high school together. He's a
Mm.
year older than I am. And we kind of ran circles around each other through high school. So he was just like, "Hey, like I know of you. I don't really know you. I'd like to know you. Let's meet."
Mm.
And he had also had a history of some deep wounding, he has a lot of loss that's occurred in his family from just like his papa was basically a huge figure in his life who he had lost to cancer.
Mm.
Some relationships intimate relationships he had been in that were just not fully true to him. He wasn't true to himself in those, and there was wounds there. So yeah, we sat down for 4 hours and we were like, I'm tired of operating out of these wounds. I want to do different for my life. I'm not going to lie to you. Like, neither of us were there. You know what I mean? We weren't like at our end goal of how we wanted to be and be healed and live our life. And I think we're all still healing. I believe that as a clinician. But it was really cool because we both just kind of looked at each other and were like, are you cool with that? Are you cool if we like prop each other up to get there
Mm.
and commit to that? And it just, it grew from there. We got kicked out of a restaurant that night because we just kept talking.
Okay, that's where my mind was going. I was like, hopefully you're keeping it all. Things were going quite well then
Yeah.
in that date. I love that, and thank you for sharing that story and a lot, behind, uh, kind of behind your origin, right? I think that anyone listening can recognize the direct influence to why you do the work you do. But yeah, I think there's so much power to that, and it's essentially like this notion of peer support and yeah, this partner support, and like we're in it together and we're working on stuff. And your story resonates with mine a bit because when me and my wife hit it off, like the timing wasn't great for either of us. Um, but we just connected, and we connected on a lot of things, and we connected on shared experience and shared pain from familial relations. Specifically, like it was kind of creeping us out how much we were not just have a similar experience in how we were estranged with our fathers, but how we were trying to conceptualize that and trying to be positive and not hyper focused, but also not brush it away under the rug. And so it does remind me a lot of that, and I think that's the type of relationship building that a lot of people listening might connect with as well. And so thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, of course. It is a weird, you know this because we've chatted already
Yeah,
before.
yeah.
It is this weird journey that I'm on right now of being working to be more comfortable sharing my personal story even.
Hmm.
So much of the and you'll probably resonate with this in a different way because this happens a lot in the first responder world. Um, but as a provider, as a caretaking profession of any sort, this kind of thing can kind of happen where we feel like we need to be a certain way, we need to present a certain way.
Yeah.
And I have wrestled with that back and forth of like, how much do you share? what will people think, right? When it's your own story,
Yeah.
it's terrifying to be like, here's this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, thank thank you for like I seriously creating a space and just who you are. And I this is like the second time we've connected,
Yeah.
but it is really cool. Like I have had the privilege of meeting with so many different people and seeing different people's gifts. Um, and so in true therapist fashion, I will reflect to you. You totally have a gift for like encouraging people, making people feel comfortable to do that. So
Well,
thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you
You've given
very much. That is very kind. I genuinely appreciate that. And if it wasn't on the recording, I would just sit here with a thought for a moment and just kind of let that sit with me. No, that's a
no
very
time.
kind thing to say. I Where my mind goes is I I love this conversation. You know, it is a conversation we started in my interview, or I suppose, yeah, it was your interview of me on your show, Mental Cover. But we talked afterwards, and we talked a little bit before this recording. But it's something that genuinely I've been grappling with for quite a while. And I think, much of my life, right? Like, how much do you want to share? And then finding comfort in sharing with your close friends, different things, and finding comfort with sharing with coworkers and colleagues, especially being in the first responder space and feeling comfortable with that. And then it's very slowly but surely. Like, so for those that might be stumbling across this podcast and just starting to learn all this stuff about me as I post and they listen, it's not really about me, but I recognize that through the years, as I've been more comfortable peeling back the onion for myself, but also for others, I've recognized and I've learned and heard feedback that was helpful. And it's not to say like I'm just sharing purely, to be helpful, like it, but I recognize that it's multi-layered. Um, when you're giving the example of impressions and how someone of certain professions might look at different perspectives or different kind of archetypes, right? And maybe for a mental health professional, you should seem to have it all together and be perfect, right? Like completely perfect, and there's no such thing. And so I love that we can just dismantle that. We're all humans, and we're all going to deal with human things. But also, I think there's so much power in that, because if I liken it to police work, something that I know best is that when I was a new cop, I was trying to be all these things, a lot of which I was not, right? I was trying to be super stoic faced and like not showing any emotion. I tried to be robotic. I tried to be impersonal, like not in that way, but I ended up being impersonal, right? I put all these walls up. I tried to be the uniform rather than the person. And man, how terribly ineffective that is. And we see videos of people doing it, and it's awful. Like, and I'm not even trying to disparage the people doing it. They might not even recognize the level that they're doing it. But over a number of years, I saw some of the most badass cops. And I don't mean badass in this like, yeah, boot the door and take names and all that. But
Yeah.
also they did that, right? They were the super cops that were catching really bad people and writing really good cases and being super proactive and being really productive. But they were also the people that were very, I mean, they're the fantastic relationship builders, and that was with their team, but that was also with the public, right? They'd be the person that would arrest someone and then truly level them, talk to them like a person, which isn't just about getting the statement, but it built relation that, they're the type of people that would actually help people after a number of years, maybe a lot of conversations, like cited as helping people get away from drug abuse, right? Get away from substance. And that's like crazy. Like when you look at that, you're like, man, if someone has a couple moments like that in a career, then that's amazing. But yeah, just to flip it back to a mental health professional, I think that there is this, I think that there's a worthy thought, which is to recognize that someone that has recognized in themselves and is working on something in themselves can be so much more effective for others. I mean, that's a thing, right? Like, if you have someone that like literally was like the genetic specimen, and they're like an athletic coach, and they're just telling you, hey, just eat better, but then they're eating like, McDonald's, and they have like a 12 pack, like it doesn't really resonate. Like, they haven't dealt with the things that they're trying to coach you on. So all to say, I appreciate that, but I think that there's so much power in just being your authentic self, and then recognizing that in that, as we continue to work on that for ourselves, and others can do the same, is that you're going to show up the best way for the best relationships and the best people in your circle.
Yeah. You bring up such a important layer too in the first responder world. There, I think historically there was quote unquote like a type, right? And I've kind of talked about that on the mental cover and like type and what we all mean by that word. But truly there are so many ways to be in these careers. And that is true for the therapist world. That is true for the first responder world. And I know I have watched my husband as he went into the career try to be somebody that he wasn't. And some of that is like, okay, he was a boot, right? So you're a little quieter and you have more things and you're learning and you're trying to absorb. And personality wise, my spouse is very much an observer. He is very much somebody who has valuable things to say and he will observe before he speaks. He is not like quick on the reaction or
So
anything.
he's
He just
wise, he's
he's
mature. Is that
very
what I'm hearing?
very wise. Yes, I've always said I gosh, when he retires, if he ever wants to be a therapist, I will he's
Hmm.
he's amazing. He would be incredible at it. But he is so wise. I have learned so much and he's made so much room for me to grow in life because of who he is and being wise. For a while, I think he struggled in the career because that was not always perceived as respectful. It was perceived as either you don't care, you're not really engaged, you're not doing the locker room talk, right? So there was a struggle that he had for a while. So he tried to do the other things. And
Hmm.
then he was just spun out small things like he wanted to apply to a particular position that was coming available. And he thought, well, I don't want to be a road dodger. I don't want to be this or I don't want to be that. And he had heard things that people had said.
Yeah.
And he was trying to operate under somebody else's lens and just tanked. Like I right around that time I booked a trip to our favorite place we go every few months as just reset for us doing what both of us do. It's a must. So I kind of trapped him in our car and I was like, so what's going on?
Hmm.
I
Well,
noticed these.
confrontation, huh?
Yeah, I'm like, can we talk about, and I had kind of touched on it already a couple times of noticing, hey, I'm noticing you're more drained. I'm not going to be the person who looks at you and says, are you depressed? Because I don't want to. There's a line. It's always an interesting dynamic being a therapist and having this real marriage, right? And being like, I know the things, I know what I'm seeing. How do I reflect them back? But respect that I probably won't be the one in full that he wants to always dive into these things with, and that's
Right.
okay. I just started to notice some stuff and just gently reflect some things. And he'd kind of given me the go away a few times. So when we were in the car and he was something about physical separation, I think for both of our mental health is so critical, just getting out of our day to day space.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and he was able to finally say, "You know what? It's just been eating me internally that I'm trying to do this, I'm trying to do that, I'm trying to make these people happy. But like I am not the kind of he is not the kind of person, this is what he had said, is I'm not the kind of person that sits here and goes, "Oh no, this person doesn't like me." It's never been he's always been somebody who's like, "Okay, that sucks and not everyone's going to like you, so it's okay." But that was just kind of getting him down for a while. And so he wasn't then going for other opportunities and being himself. And so we had this really cool chat, all that to say of there are so many ways to be in these careers and doing them and operating out of a way that's true to you. Therapist me will tell everybody people people can feel when you're not you. People can tell, just something in the exchange between people. You can tell when somebody's not them, and it
Hmm.
feels disconnected is maybe a word I would use. And so because it feels disconnected, it can be really difficult to then connect with people. So it was this really valuable and powerful chat we had of, be you, because people will gravitate towards that. And most of the time, even if someone's like, that's not my flavor, but I respect that they're them. And I don't know
Yeah.
how many times I've said that, I'm a person too. And it's like, that's not my thing, but I'm watching them be them. And that's for me as a person, because of all the things I said about my world, I'm like, God, that's amazing. I really love that. So
Hmm.
that, not that I'm not in the business of giving advice, but if anyone's listening to this and is trying to figure out how they're going to be in a career, any career, but even in first responder careers where there is a heavy culture, there is a stigma, there is a view of how you're supposed to be, the only way that you need to be is you. And
Yeah.
that is the key, I would say, to truly having a successful, feeling fulfilled, I guess is another way to
Yeah.
put that, in life and in a career in
Yeah.
general.
No, 100%. It's so much more than the career, right? Because as you're saying all these things, I'm like, yes, yes, and yes, for life. And, being in my late 30s, these are things that, I mean, life happens for a reason, no regrets. I'm very content and grateful for the path I've been on, and learning takes things, it takes events, it takes time. But man, where would I be if I would have just been more unapologetic and more confident in being myself? Not confident just as a thing, like that was a thing, as growing confidence, but just no, like be me, be okay being me. And I think that for most that question this, they're generally introspective people. They might be more I mean, there's probably a good amount of EQ because they're attuned to their own feelings. They're attuned to others and how they're being perceived, right? So they either have a good basis of that or they're working toward that. So these are good, positive things. I think that the only time and you'd really have to really maybe put the pause button on that is for those that hear this, which probably not a lot of people of this flavor listening into these types of conversations, but people that are they're hard-headed, they're stubborn, they're abrasive, they're know-it-alls, and they're not introspective, right? So it is, yeah, I'm me, I'm an a-hole. And you have those personalities in police work a lot, right? Hey, this is me, take it or leave it. And that comes off as confidence, but it's like, well, you could also be a little bit more self-accountable to be more effective as a team member, as a cop, as a person, which would uh, force you to surrender the ego a little bit. But for individuals like your husband, it sounds like, and I'd say even like us in having this conversation, it's not it's not an overwhelming ego, right? If anything, it just needs to be a more supportive sense of self.
Yeah, my husband has always said, since I've met him, what you were saying about him being wise is so true. He's always said, what's the most dangerous thing that I can lean on? And he always asks when something's going on, and he goes, my ego.
Hmm.
And anytime we watch a video of something or we're talking, kind of debating in some form, something we've seen, whether it be, it doesn't matter what it is, but oftentimes we have a lot of fun chatting about, any number of video that has been released from a call or an incident or something. And we're kind of talking through this. Um, he will be like, that's the moment that I'm wondering what's going on with that person's ego. And I'm
Hmm.
like, oh, interesting. And he's always put it in that frame of, I mean, he is, I swear he must have read like The Art of War or something growing up. Cause he's like, the biggest battle I'll ever go through in my life will be with myself. And so
Hmm.
he's way more focused on that. And in his head, he is like, yeah, but if I feel like I need to do that because of somebody else, who's actually like winning? And like, it's funny because in him checking his ego, you also hear his ego.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, but it is really cool.
It's there's an infinity loop there because even as some people listening might be like, wait, if you're saying that you don't have an ego, that's an ego, right? Like,
Right.
absolutely. And ego's not bad. It's just like who are you, and there's an imbalance at times.
Yeah, there's different layers. I mean, not to be so typical therapist about it by any means, but ego, Freud talks a lot about ego, id ego, and superego.
Hmm.
And it's really the only thing from Freud that I ever like, because he has these interesting stages of development that if anyone ever listens to this and is like, oh, I'll just see why she got awkward talking about that.
Hmm.
They're just the weirdest stages ever. They suck. I hate them. So the
You
only
heard
thing
it here.
you heard it here. Freud is like coined for the subconscious and the conscious mind, and talks out id, ego, and superego, and just our basic self that kind of has a drive and almost our primal being. Um, and then as we develop a sense of self, and then we develop a sense of how we operate with others or morality, depending on, the person, right? We could talk about like faith or spirituality, meaning or purpose comes into that realm.
Yeah.
And I always find it so interesting as I have these conversations around this part of my husband or ego and how that comes up, and especially in first responder roles, that's something that I think so many people perceive as happening. But I also think the other layer that comes in there is in those moments of those people that maybe do have a really strong ego. I've also found that a lot of people have in these careers a pretty large super ego as well, which is the part that cares about others, the part that tries to function from an idea of right versus wrong, and are put in these interesting positions sometimes of being the person who has to execute some form of right versus wrong,
Hmm.
and do that in moments where there isn't really time to think about it either.
Yeah.
So just again, to be very therapist about it, it is because I love deep philosophical conversations.
Hmm.
It is interesting. I can feel my wheels turning around that of I do wonder how many people who are presenting in all those ways you talked about have a deeper thing that even has seen wounding in the career or has any layer there that just kind of covers that up.
Yeah.
I
I
don't think most people get in this career to go like mess stuff up. Like most people go into this career because it seems honorable
hmm
in
Yeah,
some form.
absolutely. Yeah, and I've said it many times. I think that so many people do become first responders because there is that ideological and philosophical and spiritual or purposeful, like all these, I suppose, fulls, but all these things that are driving you on a greater, higher level. It's not just a job, it's not just a vocation. It is a dedication to service, to caring for others, to sacrifice. And that usually comes from recognizing something that's not so great. And that might be something that happened to you, something that happened to someone close to you, or seeing it in the neighborhood you grew up in. And it strikes such a nerve, it strikes such a chord that you want to do something extremely symbolic and impactful on a big level. Like people that sign up for the armed services. That's just not a normal thing to do these days. It's not just an average person with an average upbringing or an average disposition would just be drawn to that. And I think that's the word. You have to be drawn into this stuff. And so, yeah, in your discussion of the super ego, I love that because I think that that's what compounds a lot of these issues that we deal with, to include moral injury, because we are doing something on a higher plane, like a bigger than us. Like so many people say that, right? Like I want to be part of something bigger than myself in just what I can accomplish with my flesh and bone, with the multitude of years I get on this earth. I want to do something bigger, but with that comes the power responsibility dynamic, and am I doing the best? These aren't themes that, not to disparage, but like people in general civilian life have to grapple with. They don't have the sense of identity and what is your obligation as, a sales rep? Like how does it integrate with your moral fiber on how you live your life every moment you step out as a sales rep, representing all sales reps, and also off duty as a sales rep? Like there's not that connection, right? And so it does carry that such a different weight.
And I've never found good words for what you're talking about too, right? Because I've talked about this on the mental cover of there's something about the first responder careers that feels exactly what you're saying. It feels that it is operating on this higher plane. That's a really great way, the way you put it. And there's an intensity that can often come with that as well, right? Very different from I said in the beginning, I have my financial licenses, and technically, when you're a financial consultant and you're creating plans and all that, it's actually under like a sales heading, and that even felt really different than when I would get out of there and I would go and I'd be a therapist, and you're working with these sometimes life or death feeling situations, even if they're not legitimately life and death to that person. Some of these things internally do feel like a life or death situation, right? And then if we're talking about first responders, there is very legitimate life or death situations, and not just for yourself in moments, but for people around you. And
Yeah.
so it is it's just an interesting dynamic. I think this topic is not talked about enough. And I'll pull this up because I think about this a lot, and it weighs heavy in so many ways. And it doesn't, it doesn't get me down on a daily basis by any means. I certainly have moments, last night, for example, we had an officer down call that came out. Officer's fine.
Good.
Got in had a wrong way driver, smashed into them. So always when an officer is involved, it always comes out because, right, they have a weapon. So there's a concern of like, what if someone gets access to it, right? It's an immediate, like, get there call. But it's, right before my husband's on shift, and I just hear him say the F word looking at his phone. And I'm like, what? He's like, we have like an officer down call. And I'm like, oh, okay. And so I think about this oath that he took as he truly, when he entered the academy, because he was aware. I don't know that everybody is. Most people are. Most people don't think about it until they're in their scenarios. But it's this saying, it says, and if necessary, lay down my life rather than swerve from the path of duty. And that oath, you have to operate at a different sense of what you're doing to take that oath, to consciously say, yes, upon graduation from an academy, I will have my life taken if absolutely necessary for the sake of some greater good, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that is so very different than me walking into the E-Trade building every day, right?
Yeah.
And picking up the phone and saying, hi, this is Hailey Palos calling from E-Trade Financial. I would like to chat with you about your financial plan. Can we set a time to do that?
Yeah. You had that
Right?
down. It's like you've done it before. Maybe a past life.
Total past life.
Yeah.
I've been looking at your financial profile, and I have some concerns. Right?
You're natural. But no, like, absolutely, right? This notion of send me, right? And that's something that resonates with so many in first responder military culture, right? Like the boots on the ground in the front line, and it's so impactful, right? And even to summarize it, right, when you say the phrase "officer down," that strikes a chord. And I read it and I notice that usually I have like a heightened, like kind of like the heartbeat kind of skips
Yeah.
in times that I've said it out loud. Usually I can think about all these things and I can hear about them until I say them. Like if I tell a story, even a news story or some reel that I saw about officer suicide, if I say it out loud, then it's like it's speaking it into realness, and a lot of times it's hearing my own voice and maybe feeling the vibrations of like my vocal cords in my head and like kind of bouncing off my jaw or whatever what's happening. But I feel it, and
Yeah.
it usually doesn't always choke me up unless I get going talking about it, but a lot of times I feel it as like a very, it hits me in the gut. And I
Yeah.
think that says so much when you think about the reactions that go with that from simply reading two words that luckily wasn't a terrible deal in the scenario that you just described in
Yeah.
your hometown, but man, we know what that can be and we know what that feels like, and it's
Yeah.
terrible.
Yeah. It is. It's interest. I guess it's interesting from a therapist standpoint, right? Because we can't focus on that. There is this small part, and not everyone's probably going to resonate with this word, but there's a small part of me. I will speak for me that kind of, in order to be in this career with my spouse, operates in some mild form of denial, where when that does come up, like last night, right, I didn't cling to my spouse. I wasn't like, please don't go, oh my
Mm-hmm.
gosh, like I didn't have a whole emotional thing. My thought process went straight to, um he's going to need more rest, right, because he's going to be walking in, not just cruising into briefing and his joggers.
Mm-hmm.
There's this running joke of watching officers go into briefing, right? They're in their joggers or their Nike slides, white t-shirt, black t-shirt, whatever, right? It's like, so he's not going to be cruising in like that. He left sooner.
What is, yeah, don't tell me the agency, don't air it, but like I'm like, wait, where is this a joke? If it's a joke, that means it happens, and I'm either super frustrated or super jealous, probably both.
It's real. Uh,
Wow.
but he's going to walk in more activated, right? So my brain, and I think because I do what I do, and I am just who I am, my brain went to, gosh, what would I tell a spouse, or what would I chat about with a spouse? Which is just recognizing that he's walking into that shift more activated, right? And also, in order for me to support that when he does come home, because he's going to do what he needs to do, I'm not going to be in his ear, right? Like, once he walks out the door, he has a different support system out there and he's operating in a different mode. But when he comes home, how can I support him? And that also requires me to pay attention to the activation I felt. Even just reading that, you probably noticed, yeah, my heart rate's up. I'm a little bit more breathy.
Mm,
I don't feel my job, which is typically a place, but I can feel my eyes, right? They're like, don't do it. And it is that really hard thing of, there's a shoving down, I think, that can happen of that feeling, because if we get consumed by that in these careers as a family member or the first responder, we probably won't do them. And so therein lies this other rub that we talked about. Even that layer alone is one more layer of asking someone to operate mildly disconnected from the self,
yeah.
right? And it is a really hard reality of these careers. And the person I messaged with yesterday that I referenced earlier, I can get on my like injustice, helpless horse and be like, why is the world like this? I just wish these things didn't exist, right? And we can all have that philosophical, dreaming conversation of, gosh, I just, why do bad things happen, right?
Yeah.
Like, I just don't like that. But I know they do. So it's then, how do we figure out how we live in that? And to add a layer to our conversation here, I'm a big believer that having your support outside of these careers is a huge way that all of our first responders can go into shift, right? In that moment of like, okay, babe, what do you need from me? Was my question. What do you need from me right now? Because I'm noticing your brain is out the door already. How do I help you then just like get out the door?
Mm-hmm.
Can you do this? Can you just grab my meal real quick? Whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, cool. I
Yeah.
can do it. And having those layers existing so that some of these more difficult things that first responders, military, moral injuries, right, can be lived in truly because they're part of it.
Yeah. And where you started saying that there's a layer of denial when it's faced with the potential of this danger. Yeah, because if you fully accepted like this is gonna happen, then yeah, you're gonna be clinging to your spouse, right? But and as you kept going, it made me question or wonder more and more like, is it truly, I mean, maybe there is a layer of denial, but then it also is there this duality of acceptance, right? And I think that that's kind of what you spoke to, and you gave these examples like, okay, like I I recognize these factors. I can't physically like be there and protect him or keep him from this. Um, and it is your layer of super ego, I suppose, is like recognizing as a spouse, like, hey, there are these action oriented, impactful things, and there's also these themes of support and care and attentiveness that can help him function in the best way he can. Uh, Even something like, hey, I'm just going to grab your stuff because you're already going into autopilot work mode, and you're not going to be effective here, and you just need to go be with your people and get doing the thing. But I wonder how much of that is like a dual, uh, yeah, it's a duality or a dichotomy or however you want to put it.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. So much that I recognize in having gone down this journey with my spouse is the layer of contradictions that we live within
Yeah.
and the holding of the both that we do. And in my therapist profession, I spend a good chunk of time, I would say, helping people recognize that you can hold both. I think a lot of us struggle when we try to put things in black and white,
Hmm.
and the world doesn't operate that way. And so how do we hold both? So yes, you're right. There's a part that holds the no, like that's not supposed to happen, right? Like don't go away.
Yeah.
Go away, you know? And then there's this other part that's like, well, I know that that's a thing and I know that we're doing that and it just is. There's no making that better. It just is, you know? And we saw that firsthand in the academy. An officer got hit by a car on a traffic stop and
Hmm.
passed when my husband was in the academy. And so they had a whole like bell ceremony. And I just remember that as well. So early on, you know, we're in the career, but we're not truly, right? You're in the
Yeah.
academy. And it's a weight. It's a hard weight. And again, I think it speaks to meaning and purpose. A lot of people will ask that question. My dad, when I went to be a therapist, was like, I don't know how you're going to do that. Like, I don't know how you're going to handle all that and listen to all of that and hold it. And it's not about me. And that's how, right? And I
Yeah.
think the same can be said for first responders. It's not, maybe not for all, but for a lot of people, it's not really about them. To your point earlier, it's about something in society they've seen, something they saw in their neighborhood, something that happened to them, something, right, that they don't want to happen to others. It's usually really not about them.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, there's yeah, going back to the super ego and even in the work that, MHPs do, and yeah, like it's you know it's not going to be fun. You know it's going to have a drain, and so like how do you hold it? And part of that's like you can't. You can't, like, your hands are so big, your barrel is only so big, right? And so you have to metabolize and out process these things, which is where wellness practices, where self-care comes in, having your own person, right? Whether it's an MHP or someone else. But yeah, it's very tenuous as you think about how the super ego that brings us in is so necessary, right? Like when you're in that position where you're like, well, I could get shot right now, but we gotta go. Like there's no saying no. There's no standing at the door. We see these. I don't always want to make it about a school shooting, but you see it happen, and you see the utter success in active shooters of law enforcement around the country or the world. Like,
yeah,
hats off. Thanks for being one of us. And then you see the utter like failures, and it's so heartbreaking and just mentally jarring when that doesn't happen. But I think that's when you needed that super ego to push you through, of like, hey, this matters. But you're stuck in this self of like, oh my gosh, these are overwhelming circumstances, and they're starting to shut down. And fear, like, yeah, fear is always a thing. It's just we need courage to push past the fear and do what we have to do. But yeah, that can be so jarring when you recognize, like, yeah, you're a mere mortal, but it's part of the thing also.
Yeah. Well, in your training, right? So much of your training is around, honestly, they don't talk about this in the academy, but if I put it into therapist terms, we have a survival instinct. I talk about this when I chat about EMDR, our limbic system. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear it, but my
I
cat is
can.
like having an asthma fit on this.
I thought it was like a squeaky toy.
Dude, no, it's my sweet old 16-year-old cat. It's actually my husband's 16-year-old cat. She chose him, so
Oh, you just
just
out him as a cat guy.
he's not. He wants a
Well,
his
16-year-old cats, like, that's like a cat in their 40s, right? Like, cats live forever.
yeah, she probably doesn't have a whole lot of time
Mm,
left with us, but no, she chose my husband. I was like, let's go look at a cat when we were first together. And I finally convinced him, and then I got all nervous because I was like, this is a big commitment to do. Like, you and I are gonna get a cat. Like, I don't know. And I kind of freaked
pretty
out.
serious, yeah.
Yeah. And then she jumped on him and he was like, this poor cat loves me and you're gonna say no. I was like, oh, okay. So that's how we got Nyla. She's quiet now, so good. But
Wait, what?
um
Okay, I'm confused. So that was asthma, you said?
yeah, she has
That's like,
asthma.
she like
She's cute.
coughing? What was that?
It's a productive cough.
Oh
She's
my
had it
gosh.
since we got
I'm
her.
gonna, I'm leaving this all in because yeah, it was super surprising for me. But
Yeah, honestly, like I multiple times because cats can have respiratory issues. When we first got her, just so many vet appointments. And we finally found one and I got it on video. And she's like, that's a productive cough because of asthma. So every time the season starts to change this time of year,
wow, yeah,
poor thing. And I'm like getting all her meds. It's
would
like,
have thought.
you just had to have this kitty, which I love her. She's the best.
And I learned something today.
But
Cats
yes,
can have
cats can have
asthma.
asthma and a productive cough. Yes. Well, shoot. Now I'm thinking about Nyla. Where was I going with
You're
this?
talking about academy and
That's
the
right.
lessons of.
That's right. Yes. So much of the academy is teaching and doing something with your survival instinct. So, for example, when we talk about EMDR, we're talking about our amygdala, which is your fight flight center. It's your fear center, essentially, right? The amygdala gets activated. And there's a whole process, and I'll just kind of save everybody. If you ever go to therapy, please ask your therapist to describe this so that you have it really well in depth. I'll go somewhat, but I won't go crazy. But your amygdala activates, it sends a signal to another organ. And if I always botch which one, but it's the hypothalamus. I'm pretty confident. And then that sends a signal down to your adrenals, and your adrenals dump cortisol and dump adrenaline. And when you're in the academy, that's happening like all the time, right? If they're not yelling at you, they're having you run somewhere, right? That system is activated. They're doing this. And so in the process of training, they're really trying to train your survival instinct. Not that it's not going to go off. It is. That's just part of us, right?
Hmm.
But they're training you to move through it and to shift into your cognitive quicker, faster, right? Like get there and make some choices and operate and move. Which it's interesting. People might have different opinions about this. There is I've always wondered of, are we kind of moving people into one specific survival mechanism and kind of getting everyone to operate in the same survival realm and use their it's just an interesting.
Yeah, are you meaning like push everyone into fight rather than flight or
Right.
freeze, or more
Yes.
specific? Okay.
Yep. Yeah. So I've been curious about that, right? I think we're all capable of utilizing all of the different, right? Fight,
Hmm.
flight, fawn, freeze. It's the ones we talk about. Fawn is sometimes included, sometimes not, but I like to include that one. Some people will essentially argue that fawn is a another form of freeze in
Okay.
some way. Um, but right, yeah, we can't freeze.
Is
We can't
fawn like
flight.
is okay? Can you explain what fawn is?
Yeah. So fawn is in a situation, people pleasing is a form of fawn,
Mm,
right? So
yeah.
I'll
So
raise my
you're
hand
you're
and say,
feigning something. You're pretending, right?
you're pretending,
Mm-hmm.
right? So growing up in an abusive household, like fawn was so much of mine for a long time, right? So if I do this or I do that, right, then everything's all good and it's fine and right. And so then you're safe.
I think you just hit something on the beyond the and not to derail it, but beyond the critical stress moment or the danger moment of all these Fs. But what about the cumulative just stress of first responder life, right? So we know
Yes.
fight, like how that can manifest in your personal relationships or at work, right? You're the
Yeah.
one that's gonna bark back at Sarge because you're in fight, right? Or you're gonna generate a complaint because you mouthed off to somebody, right?
Right.
Um, Flight, you're dodging, right? Are you paper dodging? Are you call dodging? Are you dodging home by working overtime?
Yeah.
Freeze, fawn, right? Everything's fine, right? It's fine.
Right. Everything's
Yeah,
yeah.
such a carryover.
Yeah. And I think I will boldly say, and I kind of tend to keep this one to myself, but I'll say it. One of the things I really want to do in the future when it becomes more the norm is talk about this in academies, because I'm a big believer that having awareness is a huge step. We can do so much when we start to have awareness. And I don't want to change the things that are happening in academies. That's not my zone. There's so much, for example, in my husband's academy that we get to talk about and we see how it has helped and is beneficial and why his training is the way it was. And it's amazing. And I'm so happy for that, right? And I would love to educate people even more, just part of why I do what I do, around these are survival things that happen, right? So that's happening in a call that you're on, right? Your body still perceives threat. You're human. It's just by design, like that's how it is, right? We perceive when something's a threat. And in the first responder world, so much of what they teach, even in an academy, is what is a threat, what isn't a threat, right? And so small things where maybe the average civilian looks at a scenario and is like, all they did is step towards them. That's not a threat. And you're like, no, no, no. Yes, it is. Because they've closed the gap. This is a threat. Like, yeah, I'm not going to think that someone in day to day life at the Starbucks line, right, moves towards me. I'm going to be like, oh, you're just trying to like make room for people to get through the door, right? I'm not going to
Mm-hmm.
think anything of it. But in the first responder world, someone's going to do that and they're going to go ahead and stay right there,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, let's have those, right? Obviously, utilizing officer law enforcement specifically for this scenario, but even for fire paramedics, like when they're on a scene, right, they're also trained to assess like who is in a perimeter for
Yeah.
me, right, because they also need to utilize resources and do what they need to do, right? So all of those things come into play, and those are moments where that survival mechanism is being trained and utilized in the academy. What we're not talking about is our survival mechanism, our fight flight center, our amygdala, dumps the cortisol, dumps the adrenaline, gets you hyper vigilant, which again, the training is teaching you to use, but your body is going through hell in the process. So it's fabulous that this exists. It's fabulous that the academies do what they do. Shout out to Post, who's probably never going to listen to this, whoever the heck Post is, and wherever you're at. But
Someone that is part of Post at some point. I mean, yeah, there's so many posts, but yeah, California Post. Someone will listen.
right, like I love that exists and it is the way that it is. And we aren't teaching people to have awareness around that and to really understand that process in the body, and then how, to your point, that can play out in different things, where even when I do a lot of somatic EMDR. I'm a big fan of this, where maybe in a situation there was a dynamic where we wanted to say something back, but we're in an in-service position. We aren't going to say something back that would reflect poorly on you, would reflect poorly on your department, right? There's that layer you have to think about too, which is we break this stuff down. Can we just really quickly caveat to say how many things a first responder has to think about in a moment and make judgment calls?
Yeah.
It's a lot. So all of that stuff is happening. Maybe we don't get to say something that we wanted to say. And so in the process of EMDR, I might go, okay, can you go back and say that as you're reprocessing? Can we say that? Or can we acknowledge kind of where's the activating factor, and can we lean into that and match what's happening in our brain to what our body felt? Another great example of that is maybe there's someone who was in an abuse situation and they wanted to be able to run and they couldn't run, or they felt they couldn't run. I'll have them maybe kick their feet as they're processing through EMDR to sync that feeling up and kind of mend or heal the part of them that felt like it didn't get what it needed. They didn't get what they needed. If that was in my opinion, if that was talked about more, starting from day one, I really feel we could start to set people up for success, because at least we would have some awareness, some markers, some voice in our head that was going, hey, that's right. I remember that crazy therapist lady talked about X, Y, and Z, and now I'm watching that happen. And maybe it's happening with a sergeant. Maybe it's happening with your spouse. Maybe it's happening with friends. Maybe you don't have a huge support network and it's all internal, and that's starting to rob you, right? So that would be a really, really valuable and cool thing to start to have as the stigma around mental health and an awareness around what first responders are really experiencing. It's going somewhere finally. It's not maybe where we all want it to be, but it's finally going somewhere, which is really encouraging.
Yeah, I think that that's a really meaningful topic, especially as you start it with how bodies and minds are being conditioned from the very get-go coming into this career for good reasons, right? To build these survival mechanisms, but at the same time, I think it's a heightened awareness that I hadn't really conceptualized it in that way, to think that we just have more to recognize and work through, with our first responders. That, hey, it's starting at the very bottom or the very start, where you're learning these hypervigilance cycles, which are going to contribute into chronic stress just by a manner of existing. Like, you're a first responder now. You're just going to be, dialed in to a higher level of awareness and situational awareness and hypervigilance, which will make you more safe. But it is not without consequence, right? It's not without conditioning to, the point where I talk about how, especially when I was working canine, even when I had retired the dog, if my canine barked in the middle of the night, like, I would hear it and I'd be like jacked, right? I would be alert. I wouldn't be able to chill out until I looked out the window and kind of did, like, an awareness, like, was he barking at someone? Are the cars okay? Is the house okay? But even past then, like, that wasn't like, okay, back to chill. Like, I was usually awake for the rest of the night. Like, it was maybe a little bit of restless sleep, a little bit of laying there and then getting up super early and then just starting to, have coffee, as you do, right? Start your day at 3 o'clock in the morning. But all to say, like, these are just examples that can manifest a certain way. And surely not to say, like, we're just going to resign to that, but all to say that, would I be in a better space if I had more, health practices earlier in my life and career? Like, I have to believe, yeah. And that's why we're having a lot of these conversations. And so hopefully I know we are moving the needle, and, people in the spaces that we're having these conversations, and also those that are officially of a place where they can make that movement, or they're younger officers that one day will be the leaders that are making that movement, and normalizing and officializing a lot of these things. That's what it's all about.
If it's okay, I want to add one thing that I've kind of recently also, I guess, finding myself wanting
Yeah.
to advocate
Yeah,
for.
please.
There's this conversation that's happening often around senior officers versus the new age or green officers, and everything in the middle. And that language might exist differently, but we have, salty dogs is
Yeah.
the phrase that I hear very often. And as we talk about moving this needle, I think there's this perception that I have heard many times of, well, it's the salty dogs. It's, they're the reason that this still happens or this culture exists and that needs to stop. And we're all kind of, I hate to use the word attacking because it's pretty much, it's a statement to use that word.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least kind of there's this blame game that starts to happen as we have this conversation around maybe why it's here in the first place, why it continued, right? All of these things. And I've gotten really passionate about let's not isolate those senior people in this process because you know what? At the end of the day, they were also sold the same dream, right? And it's a great dream. If anyone who listens to this, I find myself always wanting to add like there's beautiful part. I love our life. I love that my husband is doing this. I love watching his confidence. I love watching him do something that makes him happy and feels like gives him purpose. It's amazing. And our life is enriched as a result. But in this conversation that keeps happening around all these heavier things, there is often this blame game. And isolating higher ups or isolating senior officers or those that we're calling salty dogs,
Mm-hmm.
I hate that that is happening because, again, they were sold the same dream, the same honor, the same purpose that all of us were and grew up with very different societal circumstances
Yep.
from, I mean, generations. We're all now generate more generations removed from wartime.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a kind of a belief of how wartime manifested in society and how that just over time created norms, created values, created systems, created cultures that we see in these careers. I mean, we're talking about war, so military is like an obvious one, right? But
Yeah.
first responders being like some local form of like order, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of what that's about, right? And so let's give some recognition to the fact that these older first responders are operating with what was normal to them.
Yeah.
And change is really, really, really hard. And maybe everyone isn't going to be on board with that, right? Like, I think about it like this. When not my finance job, but a previous job, like I knew I was leaving, right? And when you know
Mm-hmm.
you're leaving, you change, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You're like, you get your work done, but your energy is kind of like, yeah, I care a little less about what it's going to look like.
For sure.
I'm out. Right? And that's just probably actually a beautiful process within them that's starting to release, that's starting to let go, that's starting to shift and doing this natural movement into adjusting to what things are going to be like, right? Let them have that process. And let's just stop isolating people, whether they're in retirement, whether they're not,
Yeah.
But let's just stop isolating people who we're all in some form of product of experience, circumstance, and societal circumstance. If we keep pointing the finger, I think we will also keep maintaining the culture and stigma because people get defensive. People will squeeze tighter.
Yeah.
And that's not going to get us further.
No, these are such important topics, right? It's to recognize one, there's a layer of empathy where even if someone is saying something counter to our mission or what we're saying, it's to recognize that something got them to this place, and that's a different space, a different, state of the career, a different space, and how we talk about, a lot of times it's men, so men's health awareness and men's mental health and how you compartmentalize or process or generally don't, with different generations. But there's so much power with what you said, right? It's the salty folks are the ones that need some sort of wellness, whatever that looks like. And I think that's so impactful that a lot of people that are retiring or have retired there's enough people in the space that are speaking to this, and they're oftentimes the ones that are like, hey, we didn't grow up with this culture, and until I hung the belt up and put the badge down, like I was still like, hey, you're weak, you youngins, or the people like having these conversations, like you don't know what you're talking about until they realize they had to face themselves in the mirror and they had to grapple with a lot of the themes we talked about, which is loss of identity and the imbalance and all the things that they just kept sweeping under the rug. And now the rug's like, it's 2 feet high with just crap under it, and they got to deal with it. But they're some of the most powerful anecdotes. Um, Travis Gribble, shout out to him, like my arena, but he's been on the show and many podcasts, but he speaks to that, right? He said, hey, I was that hardened SWAT guy that's like, you guys are a bunch of, you guys are weak. We're not having this conversation. Like they were the meat eaters that would eat their own, right, of the other people because they weren't big bad enough, right? But he came to grapple with a lot of things and shares his story outwardly, and I think that's impactful. I think seeing some of my more senior officers at all different ranks in the department speaking more openly in a group to say, hey, people, pay attention. Hey, young men and women, like this is good stuff. I wish I had it. Like that. That's way more powerful than someone like me saying something. So I love that you encapsulated a lot of that.
Yeah, and remembering that those, even in that moment of like eat their own, I love that way of describing it, right? Um, can be some form of, I don't know how to take my activation is the word that I use instead of always saying like anxiety or whatever label we want to put on it. Just it's activating in some form. For a lot of people, that is just, I didn't have these things, so I never learned how to move my activation down. And so I continue being activated. And one of the ways I continue that is by engaging in that I will eat my own,
Hmm.
right? And it's another representation of that super ego of all of us, and I'm just going to say us, who are in this space saying these things and trying to move this needle, can also include them in our super ego process of considering others and understanding another point of view. The other way I can put that is more developmental, like our adult brains, right, can start to understand that those people are really probably not against you or even this. They don't know. So many people just don't know, and you don't know what you don't know, and we're all learning. So that's been something recently as I've even got to work closer with people shifting into retirement or post-retirement.
Mm-hmm.
It's become a zone I've been really passionate about of, you know what, this is hard for you. And it wasn't because you weren't interested. Like it's legitimately like trying to teach me French. But I've tried. That's
Mm-hmm.
hard.
No, that's so valuable, and I'm glad because I feel like I'm talking more and more about this in a lot of episodes because it is a group that we need to pay a strong attention to. Um, Hailey, we've covered a lot of ground and the ins and outs and paralleling a lot of the things I want to hit on, and then expanding on a lot of these things. So, if you could wrap up by sharing with the listeners a little bit about your podcast and where that came from, and then where
Yeah.
people can find and get in contact with you and find the podcast.
Yeah. So my therapy Instagram is Palos Practice. My website, palospractice.com. I am not a tech guru. I'm just going to say that right now. So if you go on there and you're looking for the best of the best, be a
Not
little
not the
disappointed.
tech, not the tech stuff.
GoDaddy had templates. So yay. Um, the Mental Cover podcast is at the Mental Cover podcast on Instagram. And that came out of just wanting to talk about stuff, wanting to put things out there. We didn't dive into it today. I'm starting to dive more into it on the Mental Cover, and I've touched on it. But my husband and I had a really hard time in the first bit of our career. And a lot of it had to do with culture, a lot of it had to do with my own mental health and having a baby, and how do we adjust, and is it okay to take time for your family and all of these things. And so we got really hit in the face with the stigmas that exist, and I'm going to say plural, that exist within this culture of first responder world sometimes. And so the Mental Cover podcast exists to talk about that and to bring people on who want to talk and share and have a place to be heard. And my favorite thing to do is to tell people when they come on is I might quote unquote be the host of the Mental Cover podcast, but it's shared when someone comes on the podcast. It's all about a takeover. Like, let's just have a cool chat and put something out there. So the mission is just really to keep the conversation going. My core belief in life, and my motto, I guess, is help one who can help another, and eventually we'll kind of change the world or heal the world. And so the podcast is just another reflection of trying to move the needle.
Love it. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing this space and space on your podcast, and look forward to seeing what conversations you continue in and our conversations continuing forward.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for tuning into another episode of Blue Grit Radio. As always, support this community by subscribing, giving us a 5-star review, and following, liking, and sharing posts on Blue Grit Wellness on Instagram. You can reach me there or email me at bluegritwellness@gmail.com. Be well and stay gritty.